Rod Fuller, Mike Harris, behind me, Charles Marsalis is over here, and Linda Matthews. I saw her in the back. Thank you all for being here today. Welcome back to the Senate Redistricting Committee. I wanted to start off by thanking members of the public who came out to our 13 public hearings held across the state last month. There were a number of constructive and useful suggestions made throughout the process, as the committee will be able to better respond to the concerns of North Carolinians as a result of hearing that feedback. I also want to thank the members of the committee who were able to attend those meetings to hear from our constituents, and finally, and probably most importantly, thank our staff and our Sergeant-at-Arms and General Assembly Police for helping make that process run as smoothly as possible. What we're here to do today is to begin the map drawing process. In doing so, it will be important for this committee to understand the county groupings to be used in the 2021 Senate plan. As the criteria this committee adopted several weeks ago say, we will use state constitutional standards as interpreted by the North Carolina Supreme Court in Stevenson 1, Stevenson 2, Dixon 1, and Dixon 2 to create these county groupings. These decisions specify the procedure for how the county grouping process works to give effect to the state's constitutional whole county provision and the one person, one vote principle. I won't recite verbatim what those decisions say, but in layman terms, this means the county population will be used to identify the maximum number of single county districts that can either support one or multiple legislative districts. Next, we will find, after that is completed, you will find the maximum number of 2 county districts that will support one or multiple districts that don't landlock parts of the state without a district, then to 3, then to 4, and so on through the process. Until no more counties are allowed to be grouped. So, in a moment, we'll hear from our nonpartisan staff about the different options that are available for county groupings and how they comply with the state constitution and the Stevenson decisions. I want to emphasize that the chairs believe that there are multiple options for grouping counties in a way that is legally compliant. This committee will consider maps that use the constitutionally compliant county groupings as adopted in our adopted criteria require us to do. Maps that do not use legal county groupings will not be considered by this committee. I will now ask Erica Churchill to explain the county grouping options for the 2021 Senate plans. And I think they have passed out the packet of 16 plus a blank map that's coming in with some other information. Does everyone have that? It appears that everyone has it, Erica.
Very good. So we're going to be looking at it on the screen
Senator Clark,
as well.
if you can just.
How do we introduce additional constitutionally compliant cluster maps into the process?
Anything you'd like to consider, anything will be open for you to draw or consider what you want. She's getting ready to present what we think the options are for constitutionally compliant maps, those kind of things. And so those will be open for anyone, but I'm going to let her finish her presentation and we'll go through some questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Okay, Jessica and I are going to walk through this the best we understand it. So we were asked to start with a paper entitled North Carolina General Assembly County Clusterings from the 2020 Census. It was written by Christopher Cooper, Blake Esselstein, Gregory Hirschlag, Jonathan Mattingly, and Rebecca Tippett, and is available on the Duke University website, Quantifying Gerrymandering, which is a nonpartisan research group centered at Duke Math. To the best of my knowledge, the post that released this was posted on August 17th of this year. So they started with trying to determine, as Senator Heiss mentioned, what are all of these single county clusters, meaning a county that is within a population range of plus or minus 5% deviation off of the ideal deviation for a Senate district. The ideal population for a Senate district for the 2020 decade is 208,788 people, according to the federal decennial census. With a plus or minus range, that means a range of 198,348 people to 219,227 people. So in starting their process, this group determined that there are 17 clusters containing 36 of the 50 districts that are fixed based on determining optimal county clusters. They are represented by the colored county groupings in the map that you have before you that are crosshatched. This will stay static throughout the presentation. There are 16 additional maps of how the counties in white can be grouped for the remaining 14 districts. For the fixed districts, 10 of these contain one single-member district, meaning that 10 of the 50 Senate districts would be fixed under this particular configuration. Those would be District P in Onslow County, District L, which is Beaufort, Craven, and Lenoir, District N, which is Edgecombe and Pitt, District Q, which is Wilson, Greene, and Wayne, District J, which is Johnston, District I, which is Nash, Franklin, and Vance, District H, which is Person, Caswell, and Orange, and District O, which is Davidson and Davie, District K, which is Rowan and Stanley, District M, which is Hoke, Scotland, and Robeson. The remainder of the groupings would be multi-member groupings, which means they would have to eventually be divided into single-member districts within that plus or minus 5% ideal range for a single member. So, now comes the interesting part.
So what we did was take the available options from those groupings that were in white from that first map that was on the screen and in your packet. And according to this group, there are multiple configurations that those counties could be grouped into. And so we created this chart of the different configurations. For each of the groups in white, you'll see that there's kind of 4 distinct groupings in white on that first page. One involving Buncombe County to the west, one involving Wilkes, Yadkin, Surrey, Stokes, Forsyth, Alexander, one to the southeast, and then one to the east and northeast up at the top.
And I would jump in and note, starting with our western grouping, including Buncombe, this is sufficient population for 5 single-member Senate districts. For that northwestern corner with the Wilkes, Surrey, Forsyth area, that is sufficient for 3 single-member districts. For this southeastern corner with Brunswick, New Hanover, Pender in it, that is sufficient for 4 single-member districts. And starting with Carteret, Pamlico, and all the way back over to Warren in the northeast corner, that is sufficient for 2 single-member districts.
So what we did is we took the options that were in the article Erica mentioned from Duke at Math, that quantifying gerrymandering group, and they had 2 different options for each of those white areas from the first page, and we basically did all the configurations and came up with 16 different maps. And what we're going to do now is just roll through all 16 of them. This first one, as you can see, fills in all those white spaces with one of the available options.
And I would note for each of these, remember the crosshatching is the fixed area from the Duke report. The second thing that I would note is when you see the R2, which is Buncombe, McDowell, and Burke on Duke Senate 01, the 2 means that is a 2-member district. When you see T1, which is Henderson, Polk, and Rutherford, that means that is a single-member district.
So explaining this map, you will see that here for grouping R, it includes Buncombe, McDowell, and Burke grouped together, Henderson, Polk, Rutherford grouped together, Lincoln, Gaston, Cleveland grouped together, and then move up to that second grouping, Wilkes, Alexander, Surrey, Yadkin grouped together, Surrey and Stokes and Forsyth grouped together, And then over in the southeast, Harnett, Lee, Sampson, Duplin, Jones, Pender, New Hanover grouped together. Bladen, Columbus, and Brunswick grouped together. And then over to the east and northeast, Pamlico, Craven, Hyde, Dare, Washington, Chowan, Perquimans, and Pasquotank grouped together. And then the remaining of those northeastern counties grouped together.
And as we scroll through these, you will notice that you see a variation on a theme. There will be one district or one area of the 4 that will be changed in each one of these. The remainder will remain the same from a previous version. So it is simply the configurations of how these 4 areas of the state could potentially be broken down in 2 different ways and then reconfigured with the rest of the state that can also be broken down in 2 different ways. So we're happy to scroll through these and read through each of the counties and each of the groupings if the chair would like.
Yeah.
Okay. So in the second map, you have, looking back over at the west, you have a grouping of Buncombe, McDowell, and Burke. You have a grouping of Henderson, Polk, and Rutherford, a grouping of Cleveland, Lincoln, and Gaston. To a little bit northeast of that, you've got Wilkes, Alexander, Yadkin, and Surrey grouped together. Stokes and Forsyth grouped together. Down to the southeast, Buncombe, Columbus, and Bladen grouped together. And then Lee, Harnett, Duplin, Jones, Sampson, Pender, New Hanover grouped together. And then moving over to the east, you have Warren, Halifax, Martin, Washington, Chowan, Hyde, Pamlico, and Carteret grouped together, and then the remainder would be in a grouping by themselves.
For Duke Senate 3, back
Mr.
over in
Chair?
the west, Buncombe, McDowell, and Burke would still be grouped together for a 2-member
Excuse me for
district.
just a second. Senator Marcus.
Sorry, Erica, to interrupt you. I think it would help me if you could maybe point out as you're going through these how which section of it is different from the map before. I don't know if that's what everybody else is doing, but I'm flipping back and forth between the one we just talked about and then the next one. So maybe if you could, obviously do as the chair's requested, but if you could also mention where the change is, so our eyes could go there first, I think that would be helpful.
So the first of these series,
The
first 8 of these we're going to go through. The western part of the state, the Buncombe, McDowell, Burke trio, the Henderson, Polk, Rutherford trio, and the Cleveland, Lincoln, Gaston trio will not change for the first 8 maps. For the first 4 of these maps, that Forsyth-Stokes combination with the Wilkes, Alexander, Surrey, Yadkin combination also will not change. For the first 4, the changes will be in the eastern part of the state.
Erica, it may just be simplest if you focus on each of the 4 grand pod areas and show what are the 2 options for that area, holding everything else in the state kind of consistent. That may
Very much a great idea. So starting with Duke Senate 3, let's look at the southeastern portion of the state. One option is what is now will be labeled District X. It would have 2 members. It would be Columbus, Brunswick, and New Hanover. And then the remainder of that southeastern portion would be Lee, Harnett, Sampson, Duplin, Jones, Pender, and Bladen with 2 members as well. If you want to,
Page 18.
I'll come back up.
Okay.
Whoop. Went too far. If you will back up to Duke Senate 01, that same area, sorry, I was trying to get to 2. To Duke Senate 02, that same area of the state, that southeastern corner, can be broken down differently. District X would be Lee, Harnett, Sampson, Duplin, Jones, Pender, and New Hanover, and it would be population sufficient to support 3 single-member Senate districts. The remainder, District Y, as labeled, would be Bladen, Columbus, and Brunswick, and it would be a single-member Senate district. Again, staying in the eastern part of the state, staying with Duke Senate 02, that northeastern corner One option would be to combine Warren, Halifax, Martin, Chowan, Washington, Hyde, Pamlico, and Carteret for a single-member district, and to combine Northampton, Hertford, Bertie, Gates, Perquimans, Pasquotank, Camden, Currituck, Dare, and Terrell for a single-member district.
Go back 3. Go to page 3.
The other option in that northeastern corner would be to combine Carteret, Pamlico, Hyde, Dare, Washington, Chowan, Perquimans, and Pasquotank for a single-member Senate district, and for Warren, Halifax, Northampton, Hertford, Bertie, Martin, Terrell, Gates, Camden, and Currituck to be combined for a single-member Senate district. And we will,
We need to go to map 9.
that should be on page.
Yeah.
Skipping ahead to Duke Senate 09, well, let's back up to Duke 08 for a second, just to look at that southwestern area one more time. Option 1 would be Buncombe, McDowell, and Burke for a 2-member Senate district. Rutherford, Polk, and Henderson for a single-member Senate district. Lincoln, Gaston, and Cleveland for a 2-member Senate district. The other option in that southwestern corner would be to combine Buncombe, Henderson, and Polk for a 2-member Senate district. McDowell, Rutherford, and Cleveland for a single-member Senate district. And Burke, Lincoln, and Gaston for a 2-member Senate district. Moving to that northwestern corner or area, the first option would be to combine Forsyth and Stokes for a 2-member Senate district, and Surrey, Wilkes, Yadkin, and Alexander for a single-member Senate district.
Go back 1.
The other option in that northwestern corner would be to combine Forsyth and Yadkin for a 2-member Senate district, and Stokes, Surrey, Wilkes, and Alexander for a single-member Senate district.
I will take a moment now to see if there are any questions. As I summarize this, there are 4 areas of the state where the podding, for example, in the west, will contain 3 county pods. There are 2 options for what counties cluster together for those 3. So with 4 areas in the state, 2 options in each, that will give you a total of 16 possibilities that could be selected for a map. Staff's here and will continue to answer and I will answer any questions you may have. If you please direct your questions to the chair. Senator Blue.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And it might be that the staff can answer this, but I'll ask you directly because I have the greatest amount of respect for Mattingly, Tippett, and the various others that you talked about who are involved in this project. But, and maybe staff knows, but do you know whether or not in drawing these initial maps, what the total criteria was? You said the Stevenson criteria. I didn't hear you mention some of the lawyers who would have interacted in this to determine whether in their laying out these maps, they looked at the first Stevenson criteria, which is that of Voting Rights District requirement, Voting Rights Act requirements. And so do you know whether they factored in that initial criteria in Stevenson in drawing these maps, or they just did it on population and the Stevenson criteria generally on whole county?
Senator Blue, I'm going to read directly from their
Okay, that would be helpful.
work, because I'm not really sure, other than to read directly from what they said. And this is in the very first paragraph. However, there are often multiple county clusterings that minimize county splitting. and it has links to 2 different blogs. The release of the 2020 census data allows us to determine the possible county clusterings for both North Carolina State House and State Senate redistricting processes. The one part of Stevenson v. Bartlett which this analysis does not reflect is compliance with the Voting Rights Act. To determine the county clusters, we use the implementation of the court order procedure described in Cater et al., which has a reference to optimal legislative county clustering in North Carolina. Daniel Cater, Zach Hunter, Dan Teague, Gregory Hirschlag, and John Mattingly, Statistics and Public Policy, Volume 7, 2020.
Follow up.
Follow up.
And the reason that I mention that is that Tippett is an absolute asset to the state and her population center, or whatever the name of it is, over at Chapel Hill. And she projects those numbers and understands them as well, if not better than anybody else in the state. And so she's I want to say cartographer, whatever the term is that describes those who study population and create maps based on it. Mattingly, on the other hand, is again, public policy. Statistician, and a great one at that, a mathematician, statistician. But it seems to me that if they are saying that they have not done the first thing in the Stevenson requirements, then these clusters would be suspect until that kind of determination is made. And I say all of this, Mr. Chairman, because I've lived through this, those eastern counties, and again, it's totally an exercise in academics to talk about anything initially other than the 42 eastern counties, plus 2 or 3 urban counties that were involved in the Section 5 formulation of the Voting Rights Act. And in the 80s in the litigation, it was a determination, not by the legislature, but by the courts, that they were going to basically nullify the maps in the Jingles case because of that. And since they were able to penetrate 2 or 3 urban areas, Cumberland, Mecklenburg, and Guilford, they were able to impose a broad standard across the state with all of the urban areas. And in the 90s, they determined that they would not just take the Section 5 issues, but they would impose Section 2 issues across the state. That's why you got the weird district from Gastonia to Durham, congressional district. But they cleaned it up, and then Stevenson came along in the first part of this century, and the Stevenson case, and imposed the whole county provision on it, but recognized the jurisprudence that had evolved over the prior 20 years under the Voting Rights Act. And so that's why I think Stevenson said the first thing you got to do, since state law doesn't trump federal law, is try to figure out how you comply with the Voting Rights Act as you do clusters and as you do districts. Now, I go back again to the fact that Cumberland, Mecklenburg, and Guilford are outside that range now, so you're really narrowing it again to the areas up in eastern and northeastern North Carolina, which got us on this treadmill in the first place. And if there's been no analysis made as to whether or not there's going to be compliance with the Voting Rights Act, then we're setting ourselves up again perfectly to sort of lead with the chin and be the poster child for redistricting nationally that gets struck down in this decade. And so I asked you, since you staff, pointed out that they made that an exception to their maps, can we do legitimate maps that are constitutional without seeing what the constitutional requirement is?
I don't know if you want to respond to that or not. So the response I will give is, to the question is, we believe that constitutionally compliant maps can be presented under the Voting Rights Act under these county clusters. As much as we are required to, what remaining of the Voting Rights Act to comply, we will comply and believe it can be done within these existing clusters. I see them as 2 separate things. We must comply with federal law. We must comply with state law. And within these clusters, we believe there is the options for doing both.
Could I follow up, Mr. Chairman?
You may.
Because I want to do that, but how would you propose to comply? What would be the analysis to determine that you're complying with the Voting Rights Act? That's the ultimate question, because Django set forth the criteria that you have to use to determine whether there's a Voting Rights Act violation.
Well, having gone through all these cases as much as I could, I wish it was a simple standard in which they could determine what was the demographics or the process of a district in order to comply with the Voting Rights Act. But we believe that however these districts may form or the options that are chosen for how these districts form, it is still very much possible to create districts and intend to that comply with the Voting Rights Act.
One last question. So it's the chair's position that you can actually determine clusters without doing the first Stevens analysis. Analysis is replicable. I mean, that's what the scientific approach to it is, that folk have to understand it, you have to have specific criteria, and you can replicate it. And so is it your position that we can comply with the Voting Rights Act without doing the analysis to determine whether there are Voting Rights Act requirements before you do the clustering, which is what Stevenson says you have to do?
Is there a determination that you can comply with both laws at the same time? Yes.
Mr. Chairman?
Yeah. Senator Clark.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. During the last decennial redistricting process, the General Assembly identified 3 Senate districts as being VRA districts: Senate District 3, Senate District 4, and Senate District 5. Those 3 were located in the northeastern region of the state of North Carolina. If I look at this Duke Senate 3 here, I would say that they were in the area where you have Z1, Y1, I1, N1, Q1, and L1. So what we have there are 3 clusters, each which are what I would call single district clusters. Okay, 6 of them. So how do we know that within that grouping that there are 3 that are VRA compliant, as is the case currently with Senate District 4, 5, 3, 4, and 5?
I can only speak at this point, having nothing but done, that we believe that compliant districts can be drawn within these clusters.
Follow up, Mr. Chair.
Follow up?
Mr. Chair, could we have staff provide us with the total BVAPs for those particular clusters I just identified?
I believe at this point, we don't have a sense of what a total package is, but we can provide the information that's consistent with the guidance of this committee at this point, not including racial data that's coming in.
A BVAP is a racial data. It stands for Black Voting Age Population, and TVAP is Total Black Voting Age Population, and those were used during the 2011 redistricting process. And I know our criteria says that we will not use racial data in the construction of legislative districts. However, Stevenson has already created them for us in that particular case. Therefore, I just want the data to evaluate what Stevenson has done.
And as I said, the committee will continue on the process of data that's available under its stated criteria. And I don't even know that that's available in the system.
At this time, we central staff have followed the committee's instructions, and total population is the only data available to evaluate.
Senator Nickel.
I'm just kind of trying to figure out the foundational part to how we do all this. And if we're going to comply with state law and federal law and the Voting Rights Act and Stevenson, race is a central part of all this. So how can we comply with federal law and all of this without looking at any racial data?
So we have been through multiple decisions. The last decade, the General Assembly was told by the federal courts that there is not sufficient evidence of racially polarized voting in North Carolina to justify the use of race when drawing districts. So no additional information has been presented to this committee regarding racial polarized voting, and none was received during the public comment period held last month. As we have said in the past, if information does come forward regarding racially polarized voting, we will consider it.
Mr. Chair?
Senator Marcus is next.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It seems to me that the way to answer the question is that this committee should conduct a racialized polarized voting study, and I'm asking now whether you intend to do that either before we set these county clusters or before we set the final maps.
I would repeat that no evidence has been presented to this committee of racially polarized voting. When we went through this 10 years ago, we put mountains of information together that the court found would be insufficient for doing so, and we have taken no additional action, and am aware of no commission study or others, but from this committee or from the General Assembly, but would consider anything presented.
Follow up? Just to clarify, so I hear what you're saying is nobody else has presented this committee with this information, but it's my belief, and I think many others, that it is incumbent on this committee to make that determination, and to do so, you would need a racially polarized voting study. So are you saying, Mr. Chair, that you are not going to order that study as chair of this committee, that it's somehow up to somebody else to present it to you?
I will say the committee will will consider the available information we have. There is no plan or process right now for commissioning a particular study in any of the budget processes or in legislation. So then I have Senator Clark, then back to Senator Nickel.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Dixon v. Rucho indicates that VRA compliance can be a compelling interest of the General Assembly. And we have codified, well, not codified, it's not the proper term, but we have stated, in essence, through our criteria that we consider VRA compliance to be a compelling state interest. Therefore, Dixon v. Rucho would require that the General Assembly do a racial polarization study in order to fulfill that obligation.
So, appreciate your comment. Senator Nickel,
Question for staff.
you direct your questions to the chair.
My question for staff is just, number one, can we overlay racial data if requested? And number two, can staff perform a racial polarized voting study if directed?
Racial data is not available in the system and cannot be produced for the committee. It will not be considered by this committee consistent with its criteria. I will repeat again, we have no directives right now for some kind of ambiguous racial polarized voting study that would take an indefinite amount of time in the process.
Mr. Chair?
Next, Senator Perry.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman, please forgive my impatience, but it feels like you're having to answer the same question phrased differently over and over again, and I would like to move forward to understand the information we have in front of us at the appropriate time.
So we're open for questions right now. This is kind of, I guess, the way the legal process works when people are trying to.
Mr. Chairman.
So, Senator Blue.
Yeah, one point that I would follow up on, and Senator Clark raised it. And again, staff can be of some assistance, but the jurisprudence in the area, he's pointed out that you got 3 districts that were constructed in that area beginning in the 80s and 90s that were purposefully preserved in the 2011 redistricting. And part of the problem that was resolved in Rucho is that they were overly preserved. And that is, they were guilty of efforts to pack, to use the terminology that the courts use. And there is a body of law that says before you deconstruct these districts, or basically redistrict and not take into account the history of them, you have to make certain findings. And I think that that's what these members are getting at with respect to VRA study. It might, a polarization study, it might be that a polarization study would show that you can't justify maintaining them as VRA districts. But the law is you can't deconstruct them until you sort of know that they're not serving the purpose any longer for which they were created. And that's the importance of, at least in those districts. And again, this whole effort and all of these cases over the last 30, 40 years have been about primarily this area of the state. And so before deconstructing these districts, unless you're going to make specific findings that the 3 districts that Senator Clark pointed out to us no longer are needed, or they can maintain their status as VRA-created districts, that you're walking into a trap to just deconstruct them without any of the information that would support your decision to purposefully deconstruct them or allow them to be deconstructed. And I think that's, at least that's what I gather the overview of the law in the area is. I might be wrong. But it seems that some kind of analysis along that line is necessary to satisfy Stevenson, the very first prong of Stevenson, what that case determined in 2002 or 2003, as well as the subsequent Stevenson case, and certainly in Rucho and the subsequent cases in the last decade.
So, I will continue to say is that this committee is still open to consider any information that exists on racially polarized voting. There has been no standard that has been met or that the committee should consider at this point. I would also say that for consideration, not considering race is compliant with what this body has done previously in drawing the maps and clearly in what has been upheld by the courts. So I think next I had Senator Clark and then back to Senator Nickel again. So we'll see if the questions start.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Back to the 16 maps we have before us, I had asked previously, was there a methodology by which we could introduce additional cluster maps that we consider to be constitutionally compliant? And the reason I asked that is because these maps were done using the Duke Code, which I'm familiar with, in Python, and the deviation is set at 5%, excuse me. Therefore, this goes to range from 0 to 5%, plus or minus, that is. But however, it's the prerogative of this body, should we choose to do so, to say we're going to have a cap lower than the 5%. So if you take the cap lower than 5%, there are additional options out there, and I would like the authority to submit such a map for consideration, cluster map.
So I will just say that we will take a look at anything you submitted. You're open to draw anything or others. Would be less compliant if there was a more one county pods formed in the map, more two county pods formed in the map, more three county pods formed in the map. In creating it, the plus or minus 5% is a court standard that we have utilized and adopted. If you could produce a map that produces a greater number of smaller county clusters than exists in this map, then the committee would consider that and would look to change our process.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
So then I think back to Nickel again.
Just a data question. Can we get a copy of the population groupings for each of these 16 different, it's four county groupings with, two different clusters in each of the four groupings. I'd just like to see that data, what the total numbers are for one versus the other.
Yes, sir, we can provide total population reports for each of the 17 maps.
Thank you.
Any other questions? Senator Marks.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. This is the first that this committee has presented any maps that the public can look at. And I'm wondering whether, I don't know what the chair's plan is today, for today's committee meeting, whether we're voting on these maps and choosing one and moving forward that quickly. But I would like to have on record a request that the public have time to look at these and to respond to them. And I think we need more public hearings, both on county cluster maps, but also on whatever additional maps we draw after this process. So I guess my question is, what are the plans for public input on these county cluster possibilities, and then moving forward with whatever additional maps are proposed?
So the other purpose today is to announce the beginning of the voting process that's coming in, and that may kind of be the drawing process. As you will see, this room is set up with 4 stations. I believe that one of the stations will be with the data for congressional maps, and the other 3 do all 4 have all 4?
All 4 stations will be set up, Mr. Chair, to draw any House, Senate, or congressional plan. Okay. So any member that's sitting down at any one of those stations could choose to start on any one of those 3 types of plans. And we can do a little bit of a demo as to what folks will be seeing if you would like that.
We'll get to that in just a second. That's coming in. But starting tomorrow morning, this room will be open for members to come in and begin the process of drawing. There are 16 possible options that exist under these clusters to submit maps. Some think there's a more optimal potting out there. We would be open to that consideration if there is a more optimal potting. But for right now, without that evidence coming forth to the committee will consider any of these 16 possible maps as compliant in that process. And so for the committee to ultimately consider it, it needs to meet one of these 16 parameters. If you have found a more optimal pod, please let us know as soon as possible. So what is happening after this is we are opening up the drawing process, all 16 of these maps, and the choices you make that exist within these maps will be up to the individual drawer. So I think Senator Blue is.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to make sure you alluded to not just the Senate maps, but also congressional maps too. Other than the clustering requirement in the legislative maps, is the criteria that we're going to use in the congressional redistricting process the same as was formulated for legislative redistricting?
So
I mean, I know the difference in the population, and you don't use clusters, but
there's no
all the other
variance. I
criteria-
believe that there is a determination there is no cluster that exists in the congressional maps. I think it's all 100 counties in a
Yeah.
14
Yeah.
county cluster that's coming in with the no variance. So that's coming in the same other criteria we've used for compactness and others that are out there, and for not using racial data and others are the same criteria that exist across both maps. And again, they will be open for drawing House, Senate, or congressional maps, although this committee will be considering, at least we know right now, Senate maps. The House, as is tradition, will consider House maps first. So with all that, maybe you want to get a few moments just to go through what you would be seeing in the process.
As in 2019, these will be public drawing stations. Everything that is done on one of these drawing stations will be capable of being viewed by the public. With that, Will is showing you what here in the room the stream will look like. Anyone that is sitting in the back will be able to see the screens and identify which station is the one they want to focus on. As you can see on the backs of the large monitors, there's 4 of those. They do have a sign that says Station 1, which is behind Senator Blue, Station 2, which is with Senator Clark, Station 3, which is kind of in between Senator Nickel and Senator Ford, and Station 4, which is with Senator Kravick. We'll open up Station 4, and so that everybody can see what it'll look like with the drawing active. So hopefully, as we understand that the process is going to work, the area where the stations are will be for the staff and the membership. The public will still sit in the area where the public normally sits. The public can sign on to the General Assembly Wi-Fi if they want to focus on Station 2, or they can use the monitors in the room if they want to kind of monitor what's happening at all 4 stations simultaneously. There will also be a feed of all of the audio that is said at each of the stations. So please, as members, remember what you are being said at one of the drawing stations will be, as I've heard a member say in the past, heard in Greene County and China simultaneously. Will, you want to let me sign in?
We also are going to have a video stream of the entire room, so anyone that signs on to the General Assembly website will be able to see a live stream of everything happening in the room from the perspective of that back camera.
As you can see, we have bars
They're behind the monitor.
As you can see, we have attempted to test out what is going on so that everyone will hopefully have as few hiccups as possible when the public drawing starts tomorrow morning. But this is roughly what you would see on the screen in the room. If anybody wants to come around, we'll leave this up so that you can see what the actual screens in the drawing station looks like after the committee adjourns, so everybody can take a look at that.
So, just to add to the concept and to finally get it all officially on the record. Much like in 2019, we will open this room for members for drawing maps. Beginning tomorrow, this room will be open 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday through Friday for members who are interested in working with staff to draw redistricting maps for the Senate and for Congress. Data will be available for the House as well. The proceedings will be live streamed on the General Assembly website. Only maps drawn in full public view will be considered by this committee. So if you want to draw a map or an amendment to a map, you will need to draw it here. We anticipate map drawing continuing for at least 2 weeks. Depending on the level of interest, we may have to expand the hours for drawing or open up this room on weekends as well. We will keep you updated on any changes to the schedule as this process moves forward. At this point, I will continue to be happy to answer any questions or any technical inquiries you may have about the process. Senator Clark. Senator Nickel.
Just on the timing here, when's your plan to vote on the county cluster groupings? Because it's a waste of time for a lot of Senate maps if, we're not doing the right county cluster grouping.
So the committee has not adopted one of the 16 clusters as counties. They will be open to all members drawing and available for all members while drawing maps.
Follow-up?
Follow-up?
When is that going to happen in the process? I mean, it should be sooner than the end.
We will consider any of the 16 maps that are here in this process or consider additional information that is submitted. So as we begin this process and as we go through this process, all 16 will continue to be available for the committee.
But, just to follow up,
Follow up again?
if I'm drawing a map, I can't, I don't want to draw a map that doesn't have the right county cluster groupings at some point before that end of the 2 weeks is up. So do you have a plan to vote on the cluster groupings prior to that end of 2 weeks?
We do not. So, any other questions? Hearing none, I think that covers everything we have for this meeting as we begin tomorrow at 9 o'clock. Happy drawing for the fun and exciting part of this. We look forward to doing it. We will have some specifics out for people for observation and others, but this is all streamed for individuals. So look forward to seeing you all here and look forward to all this. This meeting, having exhausted the agenda, this meeting stands adjourned.